We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. Today's podcast is from March 6, 2016. We'll continue our study of the path to the Passion with Pastor Dax in John chapter 18, starting in verse 28.
If you're willing and able, we'll go ahead and stand as we read the passage that we will be in this morning. In John chapter 18, starting in verse 28, John 18, 28. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" You can be seated. One week before his death, Jesus clearly stated to his disciples what was about to take place. And we can read about this in Matthew 20, which can be up on the screen there, Ken. Matthew 20, verses 17 and 18, we see this. As Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside, and on the way he said to them, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes." Now that's what we've seen the past 2 Sundays. Jesus then continues, "And they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles." That's what we'll look at today. He goes on, "To be mocked and flogged and crucified." That's the next 2 Sundays. And then he concludes, "And he will be raised on the 3rd day," which is why you need to be here on Easter Sunday, to see that the Passion does not end in tragedy, but it ends in triumph. But this is the point. Jesus told his followers exactly what would happen. And here in John's gospel, it plays out exactly as he said it would. Now, why did he do that? For many reasons, but chiefly, I think, so that his disciples and us would not view him as a victim, a helpless, tragic figure in all of this, but rather that we would see him as a conqueror, somebody who is making this whole thing happen. He has complete control over the situation. Now, we've seen this to be true so far in our walk with him on this path to the Passion. He has demonstrated that he has foreknowledge of all these different events. He has shown his supreme power and authority over these things. He has taken great pains to protect his disciples. All along the way, he's been faithfully obedient. He has been deliberately moving toward the cross. And yet the whole time, his concern is for others in this. And now just looking ahead for a moment, seeing how we know the story here, we know that he's going to seek forgiveness for those who crucify him. We know that he wins the allegiance of a thief hanging next to him. He even takes the time to provide for his mother's emotional and physical well-being. All of it, mind you, while hanging on the cross, suffering the wrath of God that's due to sinners like you and me. And here in our text this morning, in John 18, Jesus reaches out to a Roman governor named Pilate. And it has to be one of the most intense and searching encounters in all of Scripture. But before that encounter takes place, there's another encounter that first happens, and it's between Pilate and the Jewish religious leaders. Let's look at verse 28. It reads, "Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters." Now, Pilate, who was the Roman governor, he spent most of his time in a coast town, in a beach resort called Caesarea. It was right on the Mediterranean shore there. Much temperate climate, better place to be than inland in Jerusalem. However, when Jewish festivals were going on, like the Passover, he would come to Jerusalem because trouble was more likely to break out when you had these thousands of people descending on the city during this time, none of them in favor of the Roman occupiers being there. So he would set up shop in a military fortress that was right next to the temple. So that's why Pilate's in town during this time, okay? And now remember, as we read John's gospel, he doesn't provide you with every detail of the story here. He sort of assumes that you've read the other gospels and that for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you're kind of putting the whole story together here. Now, I don't want to necessarily assume that you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke before hearing this. So we're going to take just a couple minutes to bring you up to speed here, okay? To fill in some gaps. Now, after Jesus is arrested, he goes through two trials. There is a Jewish religious trial, and there is a Roman civil trial. And each one of those trials has three distinct phases in them. Last week, we saw phase one of the religious trial. Remember when he was led to the house of Annas? Annas was that kind of godfather figure of the high priesthood, remember? And he didn't get anywhere with Jesus, and so he quickly kind of shuttled him down the road to his son-in-law's house, Caiaphas, who was the high priest on paper, at least according to Rome. And now, phase two of Jesus' religious trial happens at Caiaphas' house. John doesn't give us this detail, so we read about it elsewhere. And what happens is Caiaphas, in the middle of the night, assembles some of these other religious rulers to come and interrogate Jesus. And by the way, this just continues the pattern that we've seen so far of illegal proceedings that have marked all of these trials that have been taking place. Jewish trials were to take place in the daylight, not in the night. And the idea was to give at least the impression that justice was going to be carried out in the sight of the people. But instead, here, they huddle in the darkness to hear this jumbled testimony from these hastily gathered witnesses that they've called together. But then, when the witnesses can't get their story straight, Caiaphas stands up and in frustration, and he says to Jesus, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Now, just by the way, that's two more illegal procedures there, if you remember from last week. The defendant is not to be questioned directly, right? And the high priest is to remain silent during the proceedings. However, the ends justify the means in this case because Jesus answers in the affirmative to Caiaphas' question. Mark records it for us, Jesus' response. Jesus says, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And the leaders rubbed their hands together. Finally, Jesus' blasphemy, from their perspective, is on record. Now we have the grounds to move forward with his execution. But they realize they need a clean paper trail on all of this, right? So they need to reconvene here when the sun comes up, which is exactly what they do. Just a couple hours later, they disperse, they come back, and they quickly, at the crack of dawn, make legal the illegal decision they had come to just a couple of hours earlier, which in and of itself is another illegal procedure because Jewish law stated that in cases of capital punishment, a 24-hour review period was necessary to make sure nothing was looked over. But they're not interested in that here because they want Jesus dead right now. Just one small problem. They're not actually allowed to carry out the death sentence themselves. Rome had taken that authority away from the Jewish nation. Rome alone possessed that authority. So if they want Jesus dead, the Gentiles are going to have to be involved, just like Jesus said would happen. And so, meet the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Now, as we move through this passage here in these first couple of verses, we're going to see three dynamics taking place. And I want you to notice the first here as we pick up in verse 28. It says, it was early morning, and watch this now. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Did you miss it? That dynamic at display? John wants you to feel absolute disgust when you read that. Why? Because of the religious hypocrisy at work there. Religious hypocrisy. Think about what's happening here. The Jewish leaders don't want to miss the Passover, so they refuse to enter Pilate's headquarters. Now, an observant Jew at this time believed that entering a Gentile's home would make you ceremonially unclean for 7 days. Okay? The Passover festival was 7 days long. If they went into Pilate's headquarters, they would miss the entire Passover festival. But the hypocrisy, given what we know of the story so far, is sickening. They won't darken Pilate's door, but they will stay up all night scheming to illegally execute an innocent man. Right? They will carefully fulfill the law, maybe even going beyond it, so that they can celebrate the Passover, all the while breaking the law to secure the death of the one who is the true Passover. They desire to keep the appearance of being holy while seeking to kill the Holy One. I mean, the hypocrisy is staggering here. It would be laughable if it wasn't so tragic. But don't miss this. Religious hypocrisy is one of the dynamics fueling Jesus' path toward the cross. And maybe that helps you appreciate that when we read the Bible, Jesus' harshest words are not for things you might expect, like adultery or homosexuality. No, he saves his toughest words for religious hypocrites. We have that passage up there, Ken, I think the next one. I want you to just see this as I read it from Matthew. These are Jesus' words. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You are, oh wait, no, it gets worse. Yeah, he name calls. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee! First clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside also may be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Now, beyond the fact that it sounds like Jesus might need to take a class on how to, win friends and influence people, beyond that here, his words reveal that we need to take the sin of hypocrisy very seriously. Why? Well, here's what happens. You can come to church every Sunday. You can faithfully drop your check in the offering box over there. You can even get involved in serving in ministry. The whole time, still stubbornly holding on to your sin. Now, how does that happen? Well, it's easy to find an excuse for your small sins, isn't it? Those little inconsequential sins that nobody knows about, those sins that aren't hurting anybody. But what happens is when you start to view some of your sins as small, you start to do them more often. Because after all, what's the big deal, right? And eventually what happens is you gradually learn how to live with your sin and keep your church face on at the same time. so that you reach the point eventually, just like these hypocrites standing before Pilate, where you can carry out your religious duties while actually sinning and not even flinch, not even lose a wink of sleep. That's the danger here with religious hypocrisy. But given their hypocrisy here, okay, John writes in verse 29, given all of this, Pilate went outside to them. And he said, what accusation do you bring against this man? Now, phase one of the civil trial is formally underway here with this question, okay? But here's what you need to know. This question from Pilate, it catches the Jews completely off guard. They're thinking, what do you mean, accusation? You know exactly why he's here. And of course, Pilate did know. 600 Roman soldiers aren't deployed to help with the arrest of Jesus in the middle of night without the man in charge knowing about it. So Pilate knows what's going on. But here's the problem. Here's where the religious leaders miscalculated. They assumed that when Pilate gave them permission to use the soldiers, that he was just going to go ahead and rubber stamp their whole process. But now apparently it looks like Pilate wants to conduct his own trial. And that makes them nervous because they know he will never pronounce a death sentence for something as silly as blasphemy. Pilate just doesn't care about that. He's not going to be sucked into this religious infighting from the Jews. Now, at this point, you have to realize that Pilate and these Jewish leaders, they're not new to each other. They know each other. They have a history with each other. They despise each other. And as we will see, they're both master manipulators as well. Pilate knows exactly why they're there with Jesus. He heard about Jesus riding into town a few days earlier with the shouts of the people. He certainly knew about Jesus wreaking havoc in the temple when he cleansed out and drove out the money changers. He knows that the Jewish leaders are infuriated at this man, and he knows exactly what they want him to do with Jesus. Kill him. But Pilate also knows. He also knows that the Jews have assumed that he's going to give them what they want. And so he asks this question, what accusation do you bring against this man? Here's what Pilate's really communicating in that question. You don't assume with me. I'm the authority here. I don't fit into your little plans. You fit into my plan. It gave Pilate a chance to flex his ego, to remind these guys that he wasn't some pawn in their whatever game they were playing here. And with that simple question from Pilate, the religious hypocrisy on behalf of the Jews is now met head on with Roman political power. That's the second dynamic, political power from the Romans. And the question becomes, who's going to win? Will the Jews outplay Pilate, or will Pilate outplay the Jews? Now, Pilate strikes first here with this question that may have surprised them initially, but these guys are seasoned veterans. This is not going to let them, this question is not going to undo them quite so easily. So they say in verse 30, they answered him, if this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. Now, wait a second. This is an example of when you need to slow down and read your Bible. What was Pilate's question? What did Pilate ask? What accusation do you bring against this man? Do they answer his question? No. Do they submit their evidence against Jesus here? No. Why not? It's because they realize they have nothing that will prompt Pilate to deliver a death sentence. And so, maybe scrambling to buy time in the moment here, they appeal to their own stellar reputations as the basis for this request. They say, we, being the men of integrity that we are, we wouldn't have brought him to you if he weren't doing evil. Right? Seems like maybe they've been drinking their own Kool-Aid here just a little bit, right? They're buying into the perception of who people should think they are. But Pilate is not going to be so easily manipulated either. Look what he says here next. And notice his sarcasm as he paints him into a corner here in verse 31. Pilate said to him, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But, the Jews protest. It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. And Pilate smirks. Oh, so you need me after all. I'm not your chump. This is what's going on here, this interplay. Religious hypocrisy meeting political power. Who will win this confrontation? And this should matter to you because nothing less than the life or death of Jesus Christ is at stake in this contest here. So who's going to win? Which will prevail? Religious hypocrisy or political power? And the answer is neither. Because there's a third dynamic at play in this situation here. It's the dynamic of divine sovereignty. Notice verse 32. John interjects into the story here. He says, "This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die." Now, just a little history here will help you appreciate what John's saying, okay? We know from other Jewish writings that the Romans took away the death penalty from the Jews 40 years before the temple was destroyed. Now, does anybody know what year the temple was destroyed? 70 AD, right. So subtract 40 years, you're brought precisely up to this point at the time of Jesus' death in either AD 30 or 33. Now, why is that significant? Now, just think about this, okay? The Old Testament penalty for blasphemy, according to the Jewish law, was death by stoning. If the Jews had the ability to carry out the death penalty, that's how Jesus would have been killed. Okay, now think about this. Given the fact that it had been prophesied that Jesus would be lifted up in his death, God intervenes and brings Rome into power. And at just the right time, they not only ban the Jews from the ability to carry out the death penalty, but they implement crucifixion as their preferred means of execution. Do you see that? It was not just the death of Jesus that was predetermined, it was the manner of his death that was also predetermined. And so to that end, God providentially orchestrated the rise and fall of nations and rulers to ensure that Jesus' death would happen exactly as he said it was, that the Son of Man would be lifted up in his death. That's amazing. With the life and death of Jesus at stake here, who wins this confrontation between religious hypocrisy and political power? Neither one. Divine sovereignty wins. And that, my friends, is how you must understand the events of the Passion. That Jesus is completely in control of this whole thing. If you don't get that, you will be confused about what's going on. What's brought these events to a head? Is it the religious hypocrisy of the Jews, or is it the political power of the Romans? Well, in a sense, both. In the sense that they were both responsible for their actions, that they both had their own wicked agendas that they were trying to achieve. But if that's where you leave it, you miss the entire point. While responsible for their own free actions, at the same time they are instruments God is using in his glorious plan to rescue sinful human beings through the means of the crucifixion of his own one and only Son. So don't miss this. How God uses religious hypocrisy and how God uses political power to accomplish his bigger agenda. Now, we have to shift gears because all of a sudden John changes scenes on us here. It's not that Pilate and the Jewish leaders are finished with each other yet. In fact, as we will see next week and the week after, their interaction is going to get even nastier. But for now, in verse 33, John tells us that Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus. What a moment this is. As these two men come and meet face to face. And for Pilate, it's going to prove to be an encounter that he, I'm sure, never forgot. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, just reading our text here, that question seems to come out of the blue, doesn't it? But the reason Pilate asks him this question is because of what he had been told. Okay, and remember that the Jews know that Pilate's never going to okay executing this man on the grounds of blasphemy, right? And when he suddenly pulled rank on them, back in verse 29, when he asked them that question, what accusation do you bring? They knew they needed some new charge, something that would stick, and they needed it right now. And it's in the other Gospels that we learn that thinking quickly on their feet, the Jews invent a new charge to bring against Jesus. He claims to be a king, they say. And it's a smart move on their part. If one thing's going to get Pilate's attention, it's going to be a threat to Roman power, especially during this time of Passover when Jerusalem is like a powder keg with all of these flocks of Jewish pilgrims in there, none of them liking Rome. But then again, as Pilate slows down and thinks about it, there's no way this man can be a real political revolutionary. Why not? Well, would the Jews have really turned him over to Pilate if he were? I mean, the Jews hate the Romans. They spend all of their time scheming and plotting ways to get the Romans out of Judea. They want nothing more than to see Rome go back and leave them alone. If Jesus was really a revolutionary leader, even a self-proclaimed king who was threatening to upset this power balance, the last thing they would ever do is hand him over to Pilate. So their newfound sudden loyalty to the empire, it's not fooling Pilate one bit here. And the way that Pilate asks this question to Jesus reveals everything, really. In the original text, the "you" there is emphatic. And the effect it has is that it reads quite mockingly, quite condescendingly. It goes something like this. You? You are the king of the Jews? Maybe said with a sneer or a scoff on his face. Verse 34, Jesus answered, as he often did, with another question. Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me? In other words, what Jesus is saying is, Pilate, you know that I'm no political threat to you. And I think you're smart enough to not believe those guys outside. So, Pilate, are you asking me yourself? Do you really want to know if I'm a king? And you see very subtly what's happened is Jesus has turned the tables now, and he has become the interrogator. He's the one asking the questions. And Pilate, who's no dummy, senses that shift. And he reacts very strongly in verse 35. Am I a Jew? You can hear the contempt there, can't you? You can hear the racism. Am I a Jew? Your own nation and chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? What Pilate's saying is, I have no interest in these Jewish matters. Frankly, they're a pain in my neck. I wish they would go away. But I also know that you're not a political revolutionary, because why would these guys hand you over to me if you were? So what's the real issue here? And what this does is it gives Jesus an opportunity to acknowledge that he is indeed a king, but that his kingdom is not what Pilate thinks it is. It presents no political threat to the Roman Empire, actually. And notice how he first defines his reign here. He does it negatively in verse 36. My kingdom is not of this world. He's saying, my kingdom doesn't originate in this place, this world marked by evil and sin and suffering. My kingdom's not from here. The author of my kingdom is God. Need proof? Verse 36 continues. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But Pilate, you know how easily I was arrested last night. I'm sure you heard that I even stopped one of my disciples when he foolishly pulled out his sword. I've told people, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. I'm not a political threat to you, but my kingdom is not from the world. Now, we don't have time to go into this, but just note that. He does not say, please notice, he does not say, my kingdom is not in the world. God's kingdom is active in the world. Followers of Jesus are called to be engaged in the world, in the culture. We do not have license to just withdraw into our own little holy huddles somewhere and ignore the world. This is not about how far Jesus' kingdom extends or where it operates. He's talking about where it comes from, the source of it. And really, there's only two choices, aren't there? If his kingdom's not of this world, not of this realm, well, that leaves either heaven or hell. Something supernatural. And Pilate picks up on this. He doesn't believe Jesus here, But he understands perfectly what he's saying, that he's saying that God is the author of this kingdom. Pilate just can't bring himself to go there. And so notice his rather weak attempt to kind of pull things back down to a level that he can deal with. Verse 37, so you are a king? That's the best he's got in the moment. So you are a king? How does Jesus respond? You say that I am a king. It's not, well, you say that I'm a king, so... No, it can also be translated, you are right in saying that I am a king here. And in verse 37, he continues, for this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. That's why I've come. That's the nature of my kingship, to testify to the truth. Now, all throughout John's gospel, the truth is not some sort of abstract idea or concept that you can't really get a handle on. No, the truth is a person. Jesus says in John's gospel, I am the truth. What does that mean, that Jesus is the truth? Well, it means that he is, in the sense that he is the perfect revelation of God, he is the truth. He is the full and flawless expression of the one true living God. He is the truth. And Jesus is saying here, the reason I've come is to bear witness to that truth, to make God known to you. I've come to tell you about God. I've come to reveal God to you. Now he's saying that to Pilate, but here's what that means for you, guys, is that you never have to wonder or be anxious or uncertain about who God is, or what he's like, or even what he wants from you. If you really want the truth about God, about yourself, about sin, about salvation, about eternal life, you simply look to Jesus. He is the one who has come to bring all the answers, to reveal the full truth about who God is. And this is where I think Jesus is so gracious to Pilate in this response. He's opening the door to him here. Do you really want to know about my kingdom, Pilate? God is the author of it. It's not of this world. And God is the subject of it. I testify to the truth. Everything I do points to him. Now, watch here at the end of verse 37. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. I think there's real tenderness in those words. Everyone who is of the truth, Pilate, listens to my voice. And it reminds us that it is not enough to just know the truth. The truth is something that has to also be ultimately submitted to, surrendered to. And so recognizing Jesus as the truth has less to do with an intellectual response, although it may start there and certainly includes that. But it has much more to do with the moral response you make to him. And what I mean by that is, do you really want the truth? Are you sure you want the truth? Well, then answer me this. Are you willing to submit to it? Are you willing to bow the knee to the truth? And the way you answer that question will tell you everything you need to know. But there's a subtle invitation in Jesus' words here. Everyone who is of the truth listens to me. Are you on the side of truth, Pilate? That's what he's asking. Do you want the truth? And so the prisoner invites the judge to become his follower. Listen to me. Believe me. Everyone on the side of truth listens to my voice. Do you want the truth? It's a gracious appeal to Pilate, who doesn't, of course, yet understand that he's standing face to face with God in flesh, which is part of what makes his response so heartbreaking. I want you to hear the sarcasm and the cynicism, the hard-heartedness, the contempt and the disgust, and ultimately the despair in Pilate's response. What is truth? What is truth? Boy, that sounds like a question that we might hear today, doesn't it? Well, I know that that's true for you, but that doesn't work for me, so good for you, but leave me alone, please, and thank you. Truth is relative. There's no such thing as absolute truth. Let's just all get along, and you do what works for you, and I'll do what works for me, and we'll not interfere with each other's lives about these kind of things like truth. Maybe postmodern ideas aren't quite so postmodern. What is truth? And the implication here, of course, is that there is no truth. That sounds a lot like our day. But the problem is, when there is no truth, there is no hope. Because ultimately, all you're left with is yourself. This has to be one of the saddest stories in the Bible. Here's Pilate, an arm's length away from the embodiment of truth itself. And he turns and walks away. How about you? Do you want the truth? Do you want to know God? Really and truly and authentically? Not know about God. Not know second-handedly. Not read a book about God. Do you want to know God personally and relationally? There's only one way to do that. You have to bow to King Jesus. And you have to enter his kingdom. His kingdom that is about God, authored by God, and points you to God, brings you to him. What is the truth? The truth is a person. Jesus Christ is the truth. He's the only way to know God. Now, how can you know that for sure? John writes in his gospel in the first chapter, he says, speaking of Jesus, he was in the world and the world was made through him, but the world did not know him. We can think of Pilate. He goes on and says, he came to his own, but his own people did not receive him. Well, we can think of the Jews there. And then he says, yet, and we praise God for the yets, yet for all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. And he still does that. So my plea with you today is that if you have been standing an arm's length away from Jesus, to not do that and then turn and walk away from him. If you've been wondering what is the truth and how can I know it, my answer is to come to Jesus. He is the truth. The only way you can know the truth is by coming to him. Are you on the side of truth? When you encounter the truth, or rather when the truth finds you, you will either respond with belief or you'll respond like Pilate does here. And it's God's desire that you respond with belief.
We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. You can find us at 193 East Main Street in Hermiston, Oregon, 97838, or on the web at yourvictory.org.